working with envelopes in Illustrator. So envelopes are basically objects that are used to distort other selected objects. The distorted objects will take on the shape of the envelope object. So imagine that you have a ball and you have wrapping paper and you have to wrap the ball with wrapping paper. The ball would be the envelope object and the wrapping paper would be the object to be distorted. So if we look at this example here, we have a circle and then we have our multiple objects behind it. So this is our envelope object and those items that will be distorted are the many stars in the background. So there are two methods that we can use to create an envelope. One is to use an object that I create, say this circle or some other object that I create. Or I can use a preset warp shape or mesh object. So what can I include in an envelope? Basically, you can use a compound path, you can use text objects, you can use meshes and blends. And so I can actually also distort my object including a linear gradient or pattern fills. And those are options that I set. If I go under the object menu and locate envelope distort, with nothing selected at this point, the items are grayed out except for my envelope options. And in those options, I can choose number 1, anti-aliased. So that basically allows me to get a smooth edge rather than the stair-step effect with some of these mesh, some of these envelopes. I can also preserve transparency, clipping mask, but then these three options here, I can distort the appearance, which by default is checked. I can also distort a linear gradient fill and I can distort pattern fills. So those options are things that you can set with your mesh objects. I'm going to just click cancel to get out of that. So let's first do create an envelope distortion, but let's use the top object. So what I have to make sure of is that this object is on top. Now what will happen, just like we see with clipping masks, this top object, which is my envelope object, will lose its attributes. So I'm going to lose the fill. I'm not going to have a stroke, but I'm going to see that my distorted objects take on that shape. So if I wanted to have a green sphere, I would have to make a copy of it and temporarily hide it. Okay? So to create this first method though, what I need to do is make sure that my object is in the front, it's the top of the stack. And I'm going to select the objects that will be involved. Okay, so this is using that top object option. So I'm going to select everything here and I'm going to go under Object, Envelope Distort, and I'm going to make with my top object. See how now all three of these are active because I have something selected. But this time I'm going to make with my top object. If I click OK, here you can see that the appearance was distorted because it looks as though this is actually wrapping around my circle or my ball. And that's the effect. Now again, if I would have made a copy of my green circle, I would place that behind this stack so you'd see the green circle with this red stars over top of it. So that's one method or one option, is to make with the topmost selected objects. Now I can also create it with a mesh, and this mesh is very similar to the gradient meshes that we just talked about. So again, I have to select everything that's involved. I also always have to tell Illustrator what is going to be involved. So I select all of my objects and I go back up to my object menu, Envelope Distort, and this time I'm going to make with a mesh. Okay, so think gradient mesh, envelope mesh, same kind of thing. So I'm going to click mesh. I can preview, and what I'm seeing is a grid. Again, number of rows, number of columns. So you can change this. They don't have to be the same. I can have more rows than columns or more columns than rows. I'm going to click OK and settle with 4 and 4. So now I have a bunch of points, similar to my gradient mesh points, I have lines and I have quadrants. So if I, using my direct selection tool, I'm going to click in the middle of nowhere to deselect. Then I'm going to click and drag to only get this column worth of points. And you can see the rest of the diamonds are hollowed out, they're white. These are selected, they're filled. And so I can either use my arrow keys on my keyboard, or I can click and actually move them. And you can see I get a handle here too, because I can tweak this if I wanted this to kind of wave in an inconsistent way. So then if I click these points, again with my direct selection tool, and I'm going to click these to go up again, you can see right away I have this really fun wave pattern that gives an illusion of depth. Okay, so that's with the mesh, very, very similar to the gradient mesh. And now my last method of creating an envelope distortion is to use the predefined warp shapes. So you maybe have seen these in different warps that you've done previously. So in this case, I'm going to again select my objects. Every time you need to select your objects. So I'm going to select this checkerboard pattern made up of white and black boxes. And I'm going to go back under my object and to envelope distort, and this time I'm going to make with a warp. And like I said, the warp has 15 pre-made shapes, and you maybe have seen these in a text warp. There's other warps that can be done that have the same options. So let's just say I choose the fish option here. And I'm going to preview it. Make sure you preview it. There you go. You can see what's happening, and I can distort this more in the horizontal or vertical, and this sort of seems opposite than what you maybe think will happen, but you can play with those distortions to make it even more, and you can play with your bend. In fact, I can bend it the other way if I want. So all of these have that sort of effect in the arch. If I go into a positive percentage, it's going to go up. If I go to a negative percentage, it's going to go down. So you can see how you can use some of these maybe to wrap, give the illusion of depth. Okay, so play around with these. Bulges out. How much of a bulge do you want? How much do you want to suck it in instead? So anyway, you have a lot of different options here that are actually quite fun to play with. If I click OK, let's just take a look at what happens in layers here. So this actually, if I were to undo this and select with my top object, I have the exact same thing. It's going to look the exact same. So it's doing the same thing. Here's the envelope. It says envelope for my distortion. So the envelope distorts 3 methods. I can create it with the top shape, I can use a mesh, or I can use one of the 15 predefined warp options.